Strange Creatures Witnesses Swear They Saw. Chapter 1. Introduction. I grew up in a logging town called Hallow Creek, tucked into a valley in the Pacific Northwest where the fog sat so thick in the mornings that the mountains didn't exist until noon. My name is Callum, and until I was 31 years old, I made my living as a wildlife photographer, chasing elk and black bears and the occasional cougar through country most people only saw on postcards. I liked the quiet of it. I liked being the only human heartbeat for miles. That changed the autumn I took an assignment from a regional magazine to document unexplained wildlife encounters in the areas around my hometown. It was meant to be a light piece, half serious and half tongue-in-cheek, the kind of thing readers enjoy without actually believing. Bigfoot sightings, strange lights, a rancher's story about cattle mutilations that turned out, on closer inspection, to be coyotes, and bad luck. I took the job because it paid well, and because it meant coming home for the first time in 6 years. My mother still lived in the old house on Route 9, at the edge of the tree line, where the valley narrowed into forest so dense that daylight barely reached the ground. She'd stayed after my father died, refusing every argument I made about moving somewhere smaller, somewhere closer to town. "This is my house," she'd say. Like that settled it. And eventually, I stopped arguing. I set up in my childhood bedroom, camera gear spread across the desk where I used to do homework, and started making calls to people the magazine had flagged as having reported something strange in the past year. Most of them were exactly what you'd expect. Elderly folks half convinced their own imaginations. Teenagers who'd clearly been drinking. One guy who wanted to talk more about his conspiracy theories than whatever he'd supposedly seen. But there was a pattern underneath the noise, if you listened closely enough. A dozen people, unconnected, none of them knowing each other, all describing something similar happening in the deep timber outside town. Something tall, something that moved wrong, something that watched from just beyond the reach of a flashlight beam and never quite let itself be seen clearly. I didn't believe any of it, not really. I'd spent a decade in forests at every hour of the night, and I understood how easily tired eyes and unfamiliar shadows could conjure monsters out of nothing. But I was curious enough, and the paycheck was good enough, that I kept making calls, kept driving to remote properties, to hear the same story told a dozen different ways. My mother noticed the folder of case notes growing on my desk, and didn't like it. "You should leave that alone," she said one evening, standing in my doorway with a dish towel still in her hands, her voice carrying a weight I didn't understand yet. "Some things in these woods you don't go looking for. It's just a puff piece, Mom. Bigfoot stories for the Sunday supplement." She didn't laugh. She just looked at me for a long moment, something old and tired behind her eyes, and said, "Your father used to say the same thing," before turning and walking back to the kitchen without another word. I sat with that for a while. The way you sit with something that doesn't quite fit, but that you're not ready to examine closely. My father had died 8 years earlier, heart attack. According to the official record, found collapsed near the tree line behind our property one October morning, camera still in his hand. He'd been an amateur photographer too. It was where I'd gotten the habit. I hadn't thought about the specifics of his death in a long time. That night, for the first time in years, I found myself wondering exactly what he'd been photographing when his heart gave out, alone, in the dark, at the edge of those same woods. Chapter 2. Strange Events. The first interview that actually unsettled me was with a woman named Deb Ashworth, a retired schoolteacher who lived alone on a property backing directly onto the national forest boundary. She made coffee I didn't drink, and sat across from me at her kitchen table with the particular calm of someone who had told this story enough times to have worn the fear out of the telling. "It wasn't an animal," she said. "I've lived out here 60 years. I know what a bear sounds like moving through brush, what an elk sounds like. This didn't sound like either. It sounded like something walking on two legs that didn't want to be walking on two legs, like it was practicing." "What did you actually see?" "Shape, mostly. Tall 8 feet, maybe more, though I know that sounds impossible. Thin in a way. Nothing living out here is thin. It stood at the edge of my garden for what felt like 10 minutes, just standing there, and then it turned and walked into the tree line, and I swear to you, its knees bent the wrong direction when it did." I wrote all this down with the professional detachment I'd trained myself to maintain, nodding in the right places, asking careful follow-up questions. Internally, I filed her under elderly, isolated, imagination running loose in the quiet. It was an easy box to put people in. It let me sleep at night. That got harder after I left her property, and my car wouldn't start. It wasn't dramatic, just a dead click when I turned the key, the kind of thing that happens to old cars in cold weather. I popped the hood, checked the battery connections, found nothing obviously wrong, and sat there in the deepening dusk, feeling the first genuine unease of the whole assignment. Deb's property sat a quarter-mile from the road, forest pressing close on both sides, and the light was going fast. I heard it before I saw anything, a slow, deliberate cracking of branches coming from somewhere in the tree line to my left, too heavy and too rhythmic to be wind. I froze with the hood still up, listening, every hair on my arm standing on end. "Hello?" I called out, feeling stupid even as I said it. The cracking stopped. Then, from somewhere much closer than I expected, close enough that it shouldn't have been possible for anything to move that silently after making so much noise a moment before, I heard breathing. Slow, deep, not human, not quite animal either, too controlled, too patient, like whatever made it understood exactly how sound traveled and was choosing to let me hear it. I got back in the car and tried the ignition again, hands shaking. And this time, it caught immediately. I didn't look back toward the tree line as I pulled out. I told myself that was just caution, not fear. I didn't fully believe myself. Over the following week, more small things accumulated the way small things do when you're primed to notice them. I found deep, 3-toed impressions in the mud behind my mother's property. Too large for any bird I could identify, spaced in a stride pattern too long for anything walking naturally. I photographed them, measured them, told myself there was a reasonable explanation I simply hadn't found yet. My mother's dog, an aging retriever named Scout, who'd never shown a nervous bone in his body, started refusing to go past the tree line at the edge of the yard. He'd stand at the boundary, hackles raised, growling low in his throat at nothing I could see, and no amount of coaxing would move him further. "He's never done that before," I said to my mother, watching Scout refuse his usual evening walk for the 3rd night running. "He's smarter than you," she said, and there was no humor in it at all. The dream started that same week, vivid, specific. Always the same tree line at dusk, always the sense of something standing just beyond where I could focus my eyes, tall and patient and endlessly still. I'd wake with my heart pounding and no memory of anything actually happening in the dream except that terrible, watching stillness. And each night, it felt like whatever waited there had come a little closer to the edge of visibility. I started leaving my bedroom light on. I hadn't done that since I was a child. Chapter 3. Darkness Grows. One decided to set up trail cameras along the tree line behind my mother's property, partly for the article, Partly, if I'm honest, because some stubborn part of me needed proof one way or the other, needed to either debunk what I was feeling or confirm it and have something concrete to point to instead of this creeping, formless dread. I placed 4 cameras across a half-mile stretch of forest edge, motion activated, infrared for night capture. My mother watched me work from the back porch, arms crossed, saying nothing, though I could feel her disapproval radiating across the yard like heat off pavement. "You're just going to get pictures of raccoons," I told her, trying to lighten the mood. "I hope you're right," she said, and went inside without further comment. The first 3 nights produced nothing but the raccoons I'd predicted. A few deer, 1 bobcat that made for genuinely beautiful footage I'd have been proud of under any other circumstances. I started to relax, started to feel foolish for the unease that had colored the past 2 weeks, and told myself I'd give it 1 more night before writing the whole thing off. The 4th night's footage changed everything. I sat in my childhood bedroom, scrolling through the clips at nearly midnight, half paying attention, half drafting notes for the article, when the 3rd camera's motion trigger caught something that made my scrolling hand go completely still. It entered the frame from the left, moving with a fluid, unhurried gait that didn't match anything in my decade of wildlife experience. Too tall, easily 7 or 8 feet, judging against the tree trunks around it, moving on 2 legs with an economy of motion that felt deliberately, unnervingly human-like. The infrared caught only a suggestion of form, dark against darker background. No clear detail of face or features, but the proportions were wrong in a way I couldn't stop staring at. Arms too long, head too narrow, a way of holding itself that suggested intelligence rather than instinct. It stopped in the center of the frame, and it looked directly at the camera. I don't know how I knew that. There were no eyes visible, nothing that should have registered as a gaze in grainy infrared footage, but every instinct I had screamed that whatever this was had known the camera was there the entire time, had chosen that exact spot to stop, had wanted to be seen looking back. It held that position for 11 seconds. I counted them later, frame by frame, my hands unsteady on the trackpad. Then it turned and walked out of frame with the same unhurried gait it had entered with, as though it had somewhere to be and no particular urgency about getting there. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat with my laptop, replaying those 11 seconds until the image stopped looking like anything at all, until my exhausted brain started seeing faces in the static that I knew logically weren't there. In the morning, I drove out to retrieve the other 3 cameras, needing more footage, more angles, anything that might explain what I'd seen the night before. Camera 1 and Camera 4 were exactly where I'd left them, undisturbed. Camera 2, the one closest to the property line, closest to where the 3-toed tracks had been, was gone. Not knocked down, not damaged, simply gone. The mounting strap still wrapped around the tree trunk where I'd secured it, cut clean through with something sharp enough to leave no fraying at all. I stood there a long time, staring at that severed strap, feeling the morning cold settle into my chest in a way that had nothing to do with actual temperature. Chapter 4. Terror. I told myself I'd stop after that. I even said it out loud to my mother that evening, trying to convince myself as much as her. I'm done with the cameras. I'll write the article from the interviews I already have. She looked at me with something that might have been relief, might have been fear that I'd changed my mind too late. Good, she said. Some things don't want to be photographed. That night, I woke at 2 a.m., to the sound of Scout barking, not his usual bark at passing cars or curious deer, but something frantic, continuous, edged with a fear I'd never heard from him before. I got up and found my mother already standing at the back door, one hand on the light switch, her face pale in the darkness. "Don't turn it on," she whispered, before I could reach past her. "Mom, what?" "Just look, quietly, please." I looked past her through the glass, out into the yard where moonlight fell thin and silver across the grass, and my breath caught somewhere behind my ribs. It stood at the tree line, full height, unmistakable now. No infrared grain to soften the details, tall, far too tall, its proportions wrong in exactly the way the trail camera had suggested, but worse. More wrong, more deliberately unnatural, in a way that made something ancient in my brain scream predator, even though it wasn't moving at all. It stood perfectly still, facing the house, and though I still couldn't make out anything resembling a face, I felt watched with an intensity that made my knees weak. Scout had stopped barking. He'd retreated to the far corner of the kitchen, pressed flat against the cabinets, silent now except for a thin, continuous whine. "How long has it been out there?" I whispered. "On and off for years," my mother said, and something in her voice broke slightly on the last word. "Your father used to see it too. He never told you because I asked him not to. I thought if we didn't talk about it, it would stay just at the edges. It mostly has. Mostly." The figure at the tree line tilted its head slowly, unnaturally, the motion of something steady, a curiosity rather than anything with an emotional response to being observed. Then, without any transition I could perceive, it was simply gone. Not moved, not walked away. Gone. The space where it had stood empty and ordinary, moonlit grass and dark trees, exactly as they should have looked all along. I didn't sleep again that night. Neither did my mother. We sat together at the kitchen table until dawn, and somewhere around 4 in the morning, with gray light just beginning to touch the windows, she finally told me what she'd been carrying alone for 8 years. Chapter 5. The Truth. "Your father wasn't just an amateur photographer," she said, hands wrapped around a coffee mug she wasn't drinking from. "He'd been documenting sightings out here for almost a decade before he died. Started around the same time you left for college, actually. I think he needed something to fill the quiet. He never mentioned any of this. He didn't want to scare you, and honestly, I think he was ashamed of how much it had taken over his thinking. He kept notebooks, dozens of them, hidden in the garage. Sighting locations, behavior patterns, theories he'd never have said out loud to anyone who might think he'd lost his mind." She got up, disappeared into the garage, and returned several minutes later with a cardboard box I'd never noticed in 8 years of visits, thick with dust, filled with spiral notebooks in my father's cramped handwriting. I spent the following 2 days reading through them, and what emerged was a portrait of a man far more consumed by this mystery than I'd ever known. He'd mapped sightings across 2 decades of local reports, going back further than any records I'd found through the magazine. He'd correlated them with logging activity, with seasonal changes, with something he called boundary events periods, where sightings clustered intensely for a few weeks before going quiet again for months or years. His final entries, dated the autumn he died, described something he'd apparently been building toward for months, a plan to set up an overnight camera vigil at the exact tree line behind our property, the same spot where I'd later placed my own cameras, without ever knowing he'd done the same. "I believe it responds to sustained attention," he'd written. the handwriting tighter than is usual, urgent. Every account I've gathered describes an escalation tied to observation. The longer someone actively watches for it, documents it, seeks it, the closer and bolder it becomes. I don't think it's simply an animal we haven't classified. I think it's something that requires witnesses, the way a fire requires oxygen. I intend to test this theory tomorrow night. If I am right, I expect to finally get the proof no one has managed before me. There were no entries after that. The notebook ended there, 3 days before he was found dead at the tree line, camera still gripped in his hand. No film ever recovered from it, despite an official investigation that ruled his death a simple heart attack and closed the file within a week. They never found what was on that camera, my mother said quietly, watching me read the final entry. The film was blank, completely blank, like it had never been exposed at all. The coroner said his heart just gave out. Fear, maybe, though nobody wanted to put that in an official report. I sat with that horrifying possibility for a long time. My father, alone in the dark, having finally gotten the proof he'd spent years chasing, and whatever he saw in that final moment, having simply stopped his heart in his chest before the shutter could capture anything at all. Why didn't you tell me any of this before? I asked. Because I hoped you'd never need to know, she said. And because some part of me has always believed that talking about it, writing about it, chasing it the way your father did, that's what draws it closer. I didn't want that for you, and now, look what you've already done. Chapter 6. Final Nightmare. I couldn't leave it alone. I want to be honest about that. The way I've tried to be honest about everything else. I had every reason to close that box of notebooks, delete the footage, tell the magazine I couldn't finish the assignment, and drive away from Hollow Creek without looking back. Some invisible thread pulled me forward anyway, the same thread that must have pulled my father out to that tree line 8 years earlier with his camera and his years of careful observation and his theory about sustained attention. I went out that final night with a single camera, no trail equipment, just myself and a flashlight, and a compulsion I couldn't fully name even to myself. The forest felt different after dark than it ever had during my years photographing wildlife across 3 states. The silence had weight to it, a held breath quality that pressed against my eardrums. My footsteps sounded too loud against the pine needles, my breathing too ragged in air that tasted like cold earth and old rain. I reached the tree line where the trail cameras had captured their footage, where my father had apparently died, and I stood there in the dark with my flashlight off, remembering his final journal entry, remembering his theory that sustained attention was what it wanted, what it needed. I know you're here, I said into the darkness, my voice steadier than I felt. I'm not scared of you. That was a lie. And something in the silence seemed to know it. The cracking of branches started to my left, exactly as it had that first evening at Deb Ashworth's property, slow and deliberate and utterly without urgency. I turned toward the sound with my flashlight raised, and the beam caught it fully for the first time, tall beyond any reasonable proportion, skin or hide the color of wet bark, limbs bending with a fluid wrongness that made my mind recoil, even as my eyes refused to look away. Its head turned toward the light, and where a face should have been, I saw instead a smooth, featureless expanse that somehow still conveyed the unmistakable sense of being looked at, studied, recognized. It took a step toward me. I ran. I don't remember most of that run. only fragments, branches tearing at my arms, my own breath tearing in my throat, the certainty that something vast and patient was moving through the trees just behind me, not hurrying, because it didn't need to hurry, because it had learned exactly how this particular hunt worked over years of watching men just like me chase it through the dark. I made it back to the house. I don't know how. I collapsed against the back door, gasping, and my mother pulled me inside without a single question, locking the door behind us both. And we sat together in the dark kitchen, listening to something move slowly, unhurriedly, around the perimeter of the house for the rest of that night. By morning, it was gone. The yard looked ordinary again, dew-silvered grass and quiet trees, nothing to suggest that anything unnatural had ever stood at that boundary at all. I left Hollow Creek 3 days later. I never finished the magazine article. I told my editor the story had fallen through, that none of the witnesses would go on record, and she accepted it without much argument, the way editors do when a story clearly isn't worth the trouble of pursuing. I moved to a city 1,100 miles from those woods, took a job shooting corporate events instead of wildlife, and told myself, the way you tell yourself things you need to believe, that distance was the same as safety. 6 months later, going through old files on my laptop, I found a video I didn't remember recording, a short clip, 11 seconds long, time-stamped from that final night at the tree line. Though I had no memory of my camera capturing anything before I ran, the footage showed the creature standing exactly where I'd seen it, motionless, facing the camera with that terrible, featureless patience. Then, at the very end of the clip, it lifted one long arm and pointed not at the camera, not at where I would have been standing, at the house behind me, at my mother's kitchen window, where a small, pale shape stood watching from the glass, exactly the height and posture of someone who had spent 8 years alone in that house, waiting, the way witnesses always seem to wait, for someone else to finally see what she had never stopped seeing.